I've been aware for quite some time now that when you look across the UK, you will find quite a lot of deaf tutors working in community colleges, further education colleges, and of course within the voluntary sector, where they teach in the main British Sign Language to hearing students. Now, in 2007, in September, new regulations came into place and a new qualification framework as well for all teachers working and teaching within the lifelong learning sector. And of course, deaf tutors working within the sector also come within that scope. I have to say that as a hearing person, I had little real insight or awareness into the particular barriers faced by profoundly deaf learners in education until about 20 years ago, when I happened to be working with a couple of deaf signing youth trainees. Now, that experience made me aware of some of the difficulties that they had faced. Imagine, if you will, being a child at school, learning English on a blackboard. The first letter A in the alphabet, what is it? It's just some chalk scribbles on a blackboard. It maybe looks a bit like a tent, but without the sound equivalent, without any phonics, it's just an abstract pattern. So you can imagine, therefore, that acquiring language and literacy skills in English can be quite a painful process for those people for whom British Sign Language is their first language, who may have been or had a significant hearing impairment before that age at which children normally acquire language. When we think about deaf signing teachers within the lifelong learning sector, we've got to realise that they may be under a requirement to achieve these new awards. And also, of course, we also need to think that they have a right to access high quality teacher education. An interpreter working with them in the classroom is obviously a help. But what about formative and summative assessment? In teacher education, assessment often takes the form of an essay or an exam or a reflective diary or log. In some cases, it may be sort of writing a fairly substantial action research project. Then there is the specialised language of teaching. In teacher education, we recognise, for example, that there is a difference between a syllabus and the much broader idea of a curriculum. How do we sign that? How do we sign that difference? How do we explain, if we're talking about theories of learning, constructivism? Is there a sign for constructivism? MSET aims to do three things. That's the East Midlands Centre for Excellence for Teacher Training. Firstly, we are eager to increase the awareness of deaf issues amongst our teacher educators and mentors so that they can work more effectively with either individual deaf signers within an otherwise hearing group of teacher trainees within a class, or with an entire group of deaf signers. And that's why we're particularly pleased to have been able to commission this resource on behalf of the East Midlands and also the National Teaching and Learning programme. Second, we are continuing to develop deaf-friendly resources to support teacher education. This in the main means that we're trying to find ways of incorporating signing into e-learning resources, which can be delivered as part of a blended learning delivery framework. Third, we are exploring at the moment and are moving forward quite rapidly now on the idea of a new curriculum for teacher education for deaf teachers, whereby we can bring deaf teachers together as a peer support group into what we might these days call a community of practice. We can give them the support of a deaf-aware teacher educator or mentor, and we can enable them to access high-quality resources using BSL signing embedded within them. And through that mechanism, we can sort of hopefully make high-quality teacher education more accessible and more immediately available to deaf tutors wherever they are in the UK, not just the East Midlands. So finally, I think it's worth saying that although in the main, as I said earlier, that deaf tutors are teaching British Sign Language to hearing students, there is so much potential here for signing teachers to be delivering a much wider curriculum of skills and education to the deaf community in the UK, and I think that's a strategy that we ought to strive for.
Action Deafness became involved with the Leicestershire and Leicester City Learning Partnership Working Group. One of the working groups is the BSL Strategy Group, which consists of the East Midlands Centre for Excellence in Teacher Training, the City and County Adult Learning Services, Deaf Teachers and CILT, which is the Centre for National Languages. Through looking at BSL as a strategy and an operational issues, we identified two main core issues that were happening for deaf teachers and for mainstream colleges. For the deaf teachers, they spoke about the lack of appropriate access to teacher training. They talked about their experiences of being the only deaf teacher in a mainstream college, having to work through English as a second language, and the lack of access to appropriate supervision within a college context. For the mainstream colleges, they talked about the lack of understanding that they had around their legislative requirements, such as the Disability Discrimination Act, the Disability Equality Duty. They also talked about the lack of understanding around the communication and cultural issues that deaf tutors face within a mainstream college, and also where to seek appropriate support to ensure that they could comply with their legislative requirements. So that's how the DVD has come about. So the purpose of producing this DVD was to look at how we can provide appropriate support, information and guidance for teacher training providers. And what's been achieved throughout this whole process is a shared commitment amongst all of the partner organisations to ensure that deaf learners can become successful teachers. And as an additional resource, there's also the East Midlands Deaf Tutor Forum that's available through Action Deafness.
When I first started work here, I worked with a deaf learner a long, long time ago, and she didn't sign. She had no BSL. She had a lot of complicated difficulties. I think she may have had cerebral palsy. And I wished very much that I'd understood more at that stage. I went on a very quick day course and learnt a little bit about some of the literacy problems that deaf learners experience. For instance, missing off the endings of words when they write, missing out little words, which of course aren't heard, sometimes not using English syntax so that words are in a different order, and so on. So I learnt those very basic things from a course. What I wasn't able to learn, and I'm only just learning now, and I'm very much at the beginning of the stage, is things like, I know when I first started working with this student, did I talk to her or did I talk to her CSW? I had to actually ask, and I asked the learner and the CSW, and they both explained that yes, it was more appropriate that I talk to the learner, but that of course the learner wouldn't be looking at me, she'd be looking at the CSW. And I think that's quite, initially that can be quite a difficult thing to deal with, because of course we're used to eye contact from the person that we're talking to. I wish I had known that it's all right actually to touch someone to attract their attention, because of course that's something else that we tend not to do. We don't make physical contact with people. I wish I had known a little bit more about the complexities of the English language before we start trying to interpret. There was another word that came up. I know I mentioned the example of generate and produce as being the same. A word that came up in a recent exam was where a character in a text had stormed out of the room. And my learner was completely floored by that. A storm for her was thunder and lightning. She was given 4 alternative words instead of stormed, which were walked, strolled, ambled and rushed. Had no idea what those were. And I found that very interesting. I realised just how visual, of course, BSL is, whereas English language depends on any number of different things. And I'm only just beginning, I think, to appreciate and understand the complexities of BSL and what a rich but totally different form of communication it is. And I think that for teachers like me, specialist teachers, it would be absolutely essential that we be helped learn these things before we start.
Reading a deaf person's English, as I've mentioned previously, is quite interesting because it is not in the same format as we would expect and how we are expected to produce our work. However, the meaning is usually very clear.
I teach literacy with the deaf student that I'm working with at the moment. She is working towards passing a level 1 key skills literacy exam. And my role is to help her with all the techniques and strategies she needs to understand the text and to answer the questions about it. And that involves not only understanding the vocabulary, but also ideas such as implied meaning, as well as very much more obvious meaning. She has to be able to skim read and scan read through a text. She has to understand grammar, punctuation, spot spelling mistakes, understand idiom, understand alternative vocabularies and so on. So there's quite a lot involved in even at a level 1 literacy key skills exam.
all deaf learners are different, and so their language ability, written, reading and writing in English is different. So support has to be accommodated to that person. They may be able to read English very well, or they may be able to speak English very well, but that doesn't necessarily correlate that they can do everything in English. They may be able to communicate very, very well without using their signs with a hearing person, but that doesn't mean because they're well spoken that they have a good understanding of reading and writing. So they're very different. Just as their deafness can be very different, so is their acquisition of English as well.
I've been quite taken aback by just how many difficulties the learner does encounter. The level of reading that's involved is really quite complex. The text that is given has often got quite a specialised vocabulary itself. There might well be a text about, for instance, there's a recent exam paper about tattooing and tattoos. There's one about snowboarding, and those in themselves are very specialised areas that a lot of any students may not have had experience of. And of course, for a deaf learner, that kind of vocabulary they may well not have come across at all unless they've read about it. I think that's one of the things that I've become very aware of, that for learners who can access speech, they may well have heard about those sorts of things just by talking to people. The deaf learner won't necessarily have heard that. So that's one area of difficulty.
Again, writing coursework and essays is difficult for deaf students. It's not impossible, and they're very clever people, but again, English is their second language. So often what is done, a communication support worker will sit with them in a one-to-one and go through the coursework, just explain what they need to do again, just to reiterate what has been said in the classroom. The student will then go away, write down their work. When they've completed it, they'll come back to the communication support worker, who will then translate it into English, ready to hand in as an assignment to the tutor. And what's often done is the copy that the student has written and the copy that has been translated will both be handed in to the tutor, so they can see the student's work and they can see the student's translated work.
Ultimately, the most important thing is it's the deaf learner that's on the course, and it's the deaf learner that needs to be able to access the information. So although it is very important for the tutors and CSWs and note takers to all be involved together, the paramount thing is to ask the student what their needs are. They have the best experience of what their abilities are. So to include them at every stage, be aware of what support mechanisms are in place and what you can offer, but then give that to the student and let them tailor it to their own needs.
For mature students or for other students who apply, on the application form they have the opportunity to declare if they have a hearing loss. It's then my responsibility to follow that up and to find out the degree of hearing loss and obviously the degree of support that they need. Again, if they need support for interviews, enrolment, etc., we would provide that support for them. An important part of the support process is the initial assessment, and we have a tutor of the deaf who does that initial assessment for us, and obviously that is the basis then for their support. And as you can probably understand, each deaf student is unique and each deaf student has different support needs.
The process when they come into college, before they actually start their course, students will come in and have a taster day to see if they actually like the course they want to go on, and we will support them on that. Then after that, if they want to do the course, they have an interview which they are supported by us. Then our tutors will assess the needs of the student. They will look at their reading and writing skills, their BSL receptive and productive skills, if they need equipment. This is done through the NATED assessment, which is the National Association for Tertiary Education for Deaf People, which is a professional body which works with FE colleges when there are deaf people there, deaf students. After this has been done, their initial assessment is written up, and a strategy sheet is also produced, and this is given to the course tutor, who then shares it with their team, so they are aware of the support needs of that student. For example, they may need a full-time educational communicator and a note taker with additional tutorials from a tutor.
In-class support can vary from a communication support worker who translates from English into British Sign Language and vice versa, or it can take the form of a note taker. If the person relies heavily on lip reading, they will have a note taker so that they can concentrate on lip reading the tutor. It can take the form of dual support in that they will have both a communication support worker and a note taker. That will enable the student to concentrate on the communication support worker signing to them whilst the note taker takes down the notes.
Well, when I first started, I thought it was all going to be so very simple, but then I realised that there was different issues with different students, because all deaf students have a varying degree of level of education throughout their growing up and their background, and also depending on their deafness as to whether or not they've had some basic structure of English in their growing up years, it will vary. And at one time I had 3 students who were doing a 7307 course, the City and Guilds, and I hadn't realised this until that time, that after I'd given the notes for the second week, they came to me and said that one student had difficulty with the language within those notes. So I thought, okay then. So I took the notes away and I modified them the best way I could into BSL for the one student, and then took them back, and she was very happy with that. She did me an evaluation form and she was happy with that. And so the next week that we went, I tried to incorporate it in one set of notes because I was the only note taker for the 3 students. And what did for 2 didn't do for 1. So as much as I possibly could, I tried to modify it into BSL. And then I sat with her later and we went through the notes together, and I asked if this was possible to continue in this way. And she was happy with that. And she said if she had any difficulties, then she would highlight those areas and bring them back the following week. And that worked fine because we worked consistently together for those months that she was on the course. And the other 2 were happy with what was provided. And as such, as we developed the rapport between us, we decided what she wanted and quite happy with it afterwards.
Tutor meal time is enormously important for supporting students with additional needs if they need it. But it must be remembered that if the student does have a communication problem, you have to book that through student support and ensure that a communicator is available at the same time.
What we would aim to do is before they start their course, we would aim to do a deaf awareness session with all their tutors so that the tutors are aware of the student themselves, they're aware of the support needs of that student, to give them an awareness of how to teach a deaf student, and we find that helps when they actually arrive on the course. In the early weeks of the course, we would also seek to do a deaf awareness session for the peer group, the students themselves, but only if the deaf student wants it, because not all deaf students want that, some don't, so we have to respect their desires. In addition to in-class support, they would have the option of tutorial support, again with the tutor of the deaf. This tutorial support is for language modification and for clarification of subject-specific language and concepts, to make sure that they have understood subject-specific terms, because it's important that they not only see the word, but they understand the concept behind that word. And that tutor of the deaf also would have level 4 British Sign Language, so they will be able to explain those concepts in their own language. Out of class, we would also provide support if the student requires it in terms of accessing college facilities. An example of that might be they might want to use the gym, in which case we would support them in the induction for the gym so they understand about all the equipment. Another example of out of class support is that they may want to access the student social centre, in which case we would help them with that.
My experience of having a BSL student in my class was quite interesting. My first priority really was to make that student integrated into the group, to ensure that they had peers that they could relate to, and to make sure they weren't isolated in any way. I also needed to give consideration to the other students in the group. So with the deaf students' permission, I did my own sort of mini deaf awareness session at the beginning of the class, so that everybody knew what to expect, how best to communicate, and to really remind them to make sure that the student was included in anything that was going on in the class. I think I was very lucky because although it was some time ago, I had a deaf awareness session as part of staff development in the college that I worked. And although it was a long time ago, I could remember some of the things. For example, a perception that if somebody wore a hearing aid, that made them hear better. And I remember that it didn't, it just amplified all the background noise. Also, previously, I'd had 2 other deaf students in my tutor group, and so I had some experience to bring to the class.
It was about 3 years ago that Warwickshire College decided to start its own in-house support team for its deaf students. Prior to this, they brought support in from an external agency. But with the growing number of deaf students that were coming to Warwickshire College on mainstream courses, the college felt that it would be better if they had their own in-house support team to provide the necessary support for all their deaf students. Our educational communicators support our deaf students in class in a variety of ways. They interpret the spoken word into BSL for our profoundly deaf students who use sign language. For our oral students, they use clear lip patterns. We also take notes in the lecture, group discussion work, we modify handouts, assignment briefs. We also support on residential visits, as one of our communicators has recently done so, and also on trips out during the day. And we also help our deaf students mix with the hearing students in the group as well.
Interpreting for deaf students in further education. Obviously there's a wide range of courses available for the students, from the entry level right through to the advanced level. So you can support a student on any of those courses, but obviously you need to have an understanding of the subject before you go in, because there can be a lot of jargon, and you need to make sure that you understand the jargon and you've got signs for that jargon to enable the student to understand the jargon. What I've done in the past, which has been very helpful, is to create a glossary with them of all the terminology for the course. We've been and asked the tutors before the course starts if they could produce a list that will be used throughout either the term or throughout the course. We'll sit down with the student, explain the terminology bit by bit.
Within colleges, my role is really for note-taking for deaf people. There's two different forms of note-taking. There's manual note-taking or electronic note-taking. I only do manual note-taking. The main difference really is the preference for the student, whether they'd like their notes electronically, so they can look at them within the class. So they can, if they've missed the interpreter for some reason, they can actually just go and look at the notes that are there ready for them. And they can just be emailed to them straight away after the lecture's finished. But for a manual note taker, it's all paper, it's all handwritten. And some students don't like the handwritten version because obviously if they can't read your handwriting, they've got no access to the English that's on there. So my role is mainly is English support really for deaf people in the classroom, to provide them with the information that's being said by the tutor.
My services at Action Deafness are to book sign language interpreters or note takers or electronic note takers, palantypists. It can be anything that deaf people need for support-wise. If we don't have them in-house, I have a list of freelancers that I can contact. So it can cover any area of support that's needed for colleges.
Our student is profoundly deaf and uses sign language as the way to communicate. She has a good knowledge of her course that she's doing. She's just finished her level 1 childcare and is competent and understands the vocab and everything that's required, and is happy to go on to level 2 with the right support. But for her to translate her knowledge to paper is where the difficulties are. Importantly, it's terminology, recognising vocab words that are needed within the course, which is where our literacy and using the key skills comes into play, because it's focusing on being able to recognise words, spellings, simple sentence structure. So her ability to express how to care for children, what's needed, requirements, health and safety, she can relay all of that, and we use her, we help her to learn new signs related to the childcare, but the difficulty is for her to translate it into English. So what we've devised is that we're going to look at translating or transcribing work that she gives to us, so that we can bring it up to the same level as her awareness, because her English isn't at the same level. Written English doesn't express her ability.
When we say deaf student, people assume they're profoundly deaf, which is the full deaf. They can't hear anything, but that's not true. Deaf covers a wide variety of people, right from the hard of hearing through to the fully deaf. They can also have many different ways of communicating. It doesn't always necessarily rely on British Sign Language. Some students may have been brought up oral, so they'll speak, which means that they'll lip read, which again can cause a problem in the classroom because they can speak, and some deaf people can speak very well and very clearly. The teachers forget they've actually got a hearing difficulty, and they will treat them as any hearing peer within the classroom. And sometimes they don't need a communication support worker, they may need a note taker. The note taker will usually sit next to them in the classroom and they will write down what's been said so they can take that away with them as a record in case they've missed any information. But the deaf person will actually be sitting there and lip reading the tutor. So it's important for the tutor to remember that they need to stand in one place where the deaf person has got a clear visual view of their mouth, so they're able to lip read and not wander around the classroom talking. But it's very easy to forget sometimes. My experiences of working in further education colleges supporting deaf students are that often in the initial stages of starting the course, the tutors can tend to be quite anxious about having a deaf student in the class. It's something new to them. They've not had a deaf student in there before. They're not sure, how do I go about it? What happens? And when they often find out that they have a support worker in with them for communication needs, somebody like myself, it makes them panic, if you like, because they think that I'm there to spy on what they do, which is not the case at all. We're there for the student. And what's brilliant is as the course goes on, you build up a relationship with the tutor and the teaching team for the course, and it benefits them, it benefits myself, and it also benefits the student. One of the things that we do ask the tutors to do is to provide handouts before the lessons, maybe a month's worth of handouts in advance, just so we can have a read through. We know what's going to be expected of us in the class, and if those handouts do need adjusting slightly for the deaf person to understand them, then we've got time to do that. We also say the same if they're going to show a DVD or a video. We ask them to check if it's got subtitles and to remember to put the subtitles on if they are available. If it doesn't have subtitles, that's not a problem, because we can stand at the side of the television and sign to the student what's being said. But obviously we'd need to see that video before it's put on in front of the class. Another thing that works very well that I've found in previous experience, teachers don't necessarily understand the difficulties that deaf students have, because many of the deaf students go into college, English is their second language. British Sign Language is a language in its own right, and a lot of people don't understand that, and they don't understand the complexities of the two languages. They are completely separate, and things like terminology and the jargon are very difficult for a deaf student to understand, because A, they may not be able to spell them correctly, and they may not understand the meaning of the jargon terminology. So what we do is we take them to one side. We've already been given a sheet from the tutors of all the terminology used throughout the course, linked to the course, and we'll sit down, we'll create signs if there aren't signs already available for the terminology, so that the student's got an understanding, and we'll also write down the meaning. So on this one sheet, it's almost like a dictionary that have the meaning, the sign, and obviously the word of what it is. And throughout the course they got that then, and they can go back and look at it. And that's a resource then that can be used and passed on to other students who may wish to do the course. The communication support worker is there to support the student on one-to-one sessions with their language, helping them to improve on their language, as well as aid them in communication in the classroom, in group tasks, etc. The interpreter is there to translate the information from English into British Sign Language, and that's it. That's the two main differences. Communication support workers or interpreters working within education should really have the minimum qualification of Level 3 British Sign Language, along with communication support worker qualification too. If they're an interpreter working in education, they should be a minimum junior trainee interpreter registered with either CACDP or with ASLI, or even both. But that's the absolute minimum, because we need to stress to everybody the deaf person has exactly the same right to access the information as any hearing peer, so it is only therefore fair to provide them with an adequate level of sign language to make sure that that language is accurately translated.
It's also important to realise that you need to have a good level of understanding of BSL. So I must stress that it should be at least a level 3, working towards a level 4, to ensure that they have good access to communication and that they have a large vocabulary range. That's very important. If you have a limited vocab, then you're not going to be able to express your understanding. So at least a level 3, certainly working towards a level 4.
One of the most important things of all that's come from my experience of working with all learners is that there are certain things that tutors can do, subject tutors this is, to help the learners access their course. True inclusion is not about teaching a deaf learner in a certain way, or a dyslexic learner in a different way, or a learner with autism in another way. There are certain things which are common to all students. They all might need at some time handouts to be prepared in advance so that they can access what a particular lecture or class is going to be about. One of the things, another part of my role is working with subject tutors, advising them as to how to adapt their resources or the class environment or anything. And this is one of the things we say first and foremost is please, please get things out in advance. It need only be a very simple handout, sometimes just the key words that are going to come up in a particular lesson might be useful. Sometimes it'll help just to put them on the whiteboard, just so that the learner has got some focus, some overall awareness of what's coming up. And there I would assume that the CSW also can give a very quick explanation of what's going to be coming up. And everybody feels that much more comfortable. And again, that helps the whole inclusion, rather than the deaf learner having to stop the tutor maybe, and so I didn't quite catch that, or can you explain, which of course is going to make them feel awkward. That skill in itself, you know, of being able to stop and ask for help, it's not easy. Many of us find that difficult. Why a deaf learner should be any more able to do that than anyone else? There's no reason why they should. Because, as I'm sure has been said before, deaf learners, first and foremost, are individuals. Some of them will be more confident than others, some will be more outgoing, some will be more impatient. You know, there's any variety of complexity of their difficulty, but also their own temperament. And that's one of the things that I think subject tutors need so much to bear in mind working with any learners.
If any tutor is expecting a deaf student on their course, I would also say don't panic, don't get worried or stressed. Instead, talk to your deaf student, have a chat with them, find out where they'd like to sit, ask them what their needs are, and ask them if they want any changes made to the course, just like you would approach any student on a course and adapt your course to meet their needs. I think about back to your planning, where you sit the deaf student, can they see everybody, can you see them, make materials available as early as possible so they can go away and read them and get their mind around the issues. Think about how to include them so they don't feel excluded. I think the best question is to ask the deaf student, what help do you need or support do you need? Because they have the best answer at the end of the day. They'll know what their requirements are. And just use it as an opportunity for groups to learn to get on together, get to know each other. What did help is that our teacher training course at Warwickshire College is actually on our learning channel. So all the PowerPoints, the handouts are up there already. And Peter and his support worker could actually download next week's handouts, next week's PowerPoint, so they had the material well ahead if they wanted it. So that she could read, Fiona, she could read through the materials as well. but it was initially the question of how to get the notes to him, so all the discussion points. So a scribe really helped. Once we got a scribe in place, that was a problem solved, really.
My tips for having a student who has British Sign Language as their first language would be to build up a rapport with that student before they come to class. It would be to integrate that student as fully as possible into the peer group, to work with the examination board to ensure that the work that they present is acceptable, using the external examiner if necessary whilst the course is running.
Through their course, obviously the students will be doing exams, and we have to, one of my roles and responsibilities is to arrange exam access arrangements to make sure those exam access arrangements are in place. The basis for that would be the initial assessment. That's the proof that the examining authorities require that that deaf student may require extra time, communication support from a communication support worker, and a separate class if needed.
Another thing that I'm very keen to do at the moment is to find alternative methods of assessment, not just for exams but for coursework and assignments as well. And I'm going to be talking to CASH, which is the organisation which covers the childcare qualifications, as well as JCQ, which I believe stands for the Joint Curriculum Qualifications Organisation, but I'm very bad at initials. It's JCQ which regulates the way exams are conducted. So there are various ways of assessing students and various concessions which they may be able to have. One that's come up recently is this business of an oral language modifier, and I need to be asking specifically what that is, what that represents for a deaf learner. It suggests that language can be simplified before the exam. So in other words, once you've told the exam board that here's a learner who needs that concession, the exam paper can be modified in advance by, this is who I don't know, I don't understand. The suggestion I would have thought must be that it should be modified by a highly qualified CSW who understands the complexities of the learner as well as the subject. But that's something I'm going to ask about. Another issue that's come up, certainly with regard to this particular student and her childcare requirements, is that next year she will need to show evidence of practical competence. So there will be a lot of practical sessions, which would normally be ticked off by an observer. Again, I need to ask CASH on this occasion what it is they'll require as evidence of her having shown that particular competence in a particular field.
We can advise our deaf students, if they're having problems with their written English, is to put their assignment work onto video, and they sign their assignments, and then we can provide a voiceover with the tutors or the communicators and present this to the tutors, and a lot of the examination boards are very happy to accept this as well. So they have found, our deaf students have found this very, very useful and a lot better, and they feel more confident in putting it onto video and signing it than they would in the written word, because they can express themselves as they want to express themselves, and they're not held back by their limits in English language.
I really must emphasise, though, when assessing a deaf student's work whose first language is British Sign Language, that this is clarified at the very beginning with the examination board. A lot of qualifications have embedded communication skills, and we've got to remember that their communication skills are different.